Good morning. So on today's walk, we're going to talk about that securities trade life cycle. It's just as boring as dirt. From what happens in the front office, a term I'll explain on the walk, to how and why and when it flows to the middle office and the back office. More terms I'll explain in a sec. I'm thinking about this end to end. So I'll be talking about every component of the securities trade life cycle in the sequence in which a trade is processed. As you'll see, each step is critical, and each step has an impact to how the trade is processed in steps further down. We'll cover all that and go into how it all ties into what's called straight-through processing, STP for short. One of the most impactful ambitions that security processing companies have and have had for a long time. STP is basically shorthand for we can process trades without people involved, or, more people involved, getting companies a little bit closer to being scalable businesses, not needing more people as they get more business. So I'll try to define all the industry specific jargon like STP, and we'll cover the order in which everything happens, the risks at each step, and the usual mitigating controls. Even the term mitigating controls is industry jargon. In plain English, mitigating control is like a series of steps or a procedure that a person uses to make sure what they're doing is correct, reproducible, evidenceable. Just a fancy term for wearing belt and suspenders. So you're doubly protected against your pants falling off, which, when you're talking about trillions of dollars, is a very expensive wardrobe malfunction. So we'll cover the risks in the processing of securities trades and why there are so many controls to mitigate those risks. And before I start, I should say that this is the third of the kind of videos I do, and it probably should have been the first, because I was looking around online, and every time you want to learn something about our industry, you have to pay for it. Like you have to go to some professional or try to piece together 50 different YouTube videos, which is just a barrier to entry to getting more people into our industry. So I'm going to do what, is incredibly boring for me and you, but it's done with good intent. Okay, some quick definitions. The securities trade lifecycle itself is a series of steps that any trade goes through, from placing an order, buy 10 shares of Apple, to the settlement of that trade, which, if you watch my video on custody banking, is when everything about the buying and selling of those 10 shares is done and dusted. Doesn't matter if you're an investment banker buying 10 shares of Apple, or you're an individual investor like you or me, or you work at what are called buy-side firms like asset managers or hedge funds, or mutual fund, pension funds, insurance companies. The term buy-side just means that you have an investment strategy and the money to execute that strategy by buying and selling stocks, as opposed to a sell-side firm like an investment bank or an advisory firm, or any company really that helps create the conditions of a well-functioning market, bringing together buyers and sellers, making it easy for them to buy and sell. So what do we call the institutional actor that buys and sells these securities? The front office. When you hear about some fancy front office workspace that's built for portfolio managers and research staff providing real-time data from internal and external, blah, 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 blah. It's just what they use, the front office, to buy and sell securities. Once they're bought or sold, that purchase flows through some kind of system or process that manages risk and calculates profits and losses. We call that the middle office. And then it flows to the back office, even though the middle office is really part of the back office. And the back office's goal is to do everything necessary to settle that trade by its due date. In the world of financial services, the middle office and the back office are also just called operations, or ops. That process, from the buying or selling of the security to its reasonably quick settlement, in a nutshell, is the objective of a trade lifecycle. So let's step back, set the table slowly. Before anyone executes a trade, before anyone buys or sells anything, before anyone manages its risk or settles it in the markets, what do you need in place? Let's go tech for a second. You need a reference data platform. Most companies call that a security master or client master, or they call it by some internal system name. Like at Merrill, they call it Quartz. At Bank of America, it's called PSM. At JP, ORCAP, and BNY, it was called SMDB, popular acronym, and completely lacking imagination because SMDB is short for Security Master Database. It's like naming your dog. A security master holds information about every security, stocks, bonds, everything that anyone in the trade lifecycle will be potentially dealing with. Just like a client master holds information about everyone, every client, every counterparty that the trade lifecycle will be dealing with. Again, a counterparty is just a fancy term for a person or institution on the opposite side of each trade, buyers and sellers. Now, the better your information about securities, reference data, essentially clients, counterparties, the more accurate and up-to-date that information is, the higher your chance of achieving STP, straight through processing. If you have to process a trade where you don't have the counterparty set up in your data masters, or the data about them is stale, it won't necessarily stop you from executing the trade, but it will add a bunch of painful manual steps, time and effort to processing the trade end to end. So back to the definitions. The front office buys, sells, or executes the trade. And there's always someone on the other side of that trade. If you're buying, there's a seller on the other side. If you're selling, there's a buyer on the other side. And we call that other the counterparty. That trade is recorded in a bunch of systems, yours, the counterparties, the markets. And that's when the fun really begins, because none of those systems are connected. Every aspect of the trade needs to be reconciled across multiple parties. For instance, the trade is captured in a front office system. Fancy. And because system designers are human and a little stupid, not every piece of data that the lifecycle will need is captured in that system. Usually a front office platform captures just enough for the traders to do their job and for the back office to start theirs. That's usually the minimum details associated with the trade. I'll mention a little further down our walk what those minimum details are. They're about 7 pieces of information that front office systems always capture, that they always pass to the back office systems. And it'll become obvious why having high quality static data or reference data, that stuff in the master, is so important when you need to successfully capture and communicate trade details. So these are generally 2 separate systems, front and back office. The one in the front is sometimes called an order management system, OMS. And the one in the back usually has a 3-letter acronym that only ops people know. So if a trade has been successfully captured in one, unfortunately, there's no guarantee that the trade details will be successfully captured in the other. Why? Again, because the back office systems might be using different reference data platforms, a different security master, client master, or the freshness of their data might be different from platform to platform. The key thing to understand is that minus some thoughtful design in both the front and back office systems, and minus some rigor with data management practices, the processes, data mismatches will happen frequently. And each one becomes a reconciliation issue, hard manual work that no one wants to do. It's pure tedium. But just to push the ball forward, let's say that the front office system successfully captured the trade details and passed what they have successfully to the back office system, the one used by operational teams. Well, there's still a problem with that data, usually, because front office systems, as I said, are built purposefully designed, probably the better word to use, for the front office, not for post-trade activity. So they don't capture every bit of data during the trade that will be needed post-trade. They capture a subset and assume that the back office systems will fill in the rest. That's where we meet our friend, trade enrichment. Industry jargon for a process every back office is intimately familiar with, a process that uses their reference data to fill in all the data holes in the trade data that was sent from the front office. Trade enrichment. Once the trade data is enriched, the next step is trade confirmation, which is getting the other party to confirm that you got the right data or the data right. Because remember, their systems and processes are just as incomplete and broken as yours are. They, the counterparty, are going through this exact same process internally at their shop with their front office and back office. So is it possible to end up with different details? Yes, at scale. Not onesie twosies. Millions of mismatches a day across the markets. Serious inefficiency. Every day across the world, the trade confirmation process is thousands, hundreds of thousands. Front offices with their respective back offices communicating like crazy with thousands of other front offices with their respective back offices. All just trying to validate that the details of each individual transaction is the same, their place and at their counterparties. Lots of comms, emails, phone calls, carrier pigeons, because each system was designed independently of every other system, and everyone keeps their own version of the data that everyone else needs, their own version of the truth. Okay, so let's say that we get to the point where all the counterparties agree on the trade details for an individual trade. What comes next? The issuance of settlement instructions. That's a term of art, industry jargon for communications to the markets, to settlement agents like custodians or depositories, that they, as the buyer or seller, are okay with the buy or the sell at a specific price. I went into the roles of custodians and depositories, like the DTCC, during my walkabout custody banking. Those folks, the ones who do the final inch of the settlement process, well, up until this point in the trade lifecycle, those folks did not know anything about the trade at all. They don't need to know. They just need someone who they know and trust, someone who owns 10 shares of Apple, to tell them that they sold it to someone else for $1. And that someone else to acknowledge that, yes, indeed, they bought those 10 shares for $1. So once the settlement instruction has been issued by each of the counterparties, everyone just keeps checking the status, what's called the pre-settlement status of that instruction. Refresh, refresh, refresh on your browser. Once that middleman comes back with a thumbs up, both sides will know that specific trade was matched by the other side, the counterparty. But given all the complexity and poor data quality, there's also a pretty good chance it'll come back with a thumbs down, that it remains unmatched. There's a little loop in the process at this point, if it remains unmatched, as both sides go through the motions again of verifying that all their data matches all the counterparty's data. They call that trade investigation, and spend a ton of time resolving the reasons why a trade was unmatched. Because for a successful settlement to complete, both sides need to have their instructions match perfectly. Then a settlement can happen. By the way, it's not completely perfect. I'll explain that probably a half a mile down. So The industry spends gazillions of dollars making sure instructions are matched despite disconnected systems, despite everyone having their own version of reference data, their own versions of the truth. And even if the instruction is matched, the trade can still fail to settle because of father time. There's a ticking clock during all this. And if that tedious process doesn't happen fast enough by what's called the due date of the settlement, too bad. Both sides of that trade will be pissed. Success means you got it all right before the due date, that you got the thumbs up from your custodian or depository, or the trade has not settled. Once that thumbs up email comes in, that trade has officially settled. It's time for the exchange of securities for cash and vice versa. This is where when we go into whatever system houses the client's portfolio, whatever system holds their cash balances and their security holdings, and reflect that fact, that settlement, that it has occurred for that transaction. Why should we do that? Because up until this point in the life cycle, this trade has had a status of open with the counterparty. That's financial exposure. Risk with the counterparty when settlement occurs. This step itself ends with, the end of that exposure with the counterparty. It eliminates the risk. We update our books and records, industry jargon for the official list of who owns what, books and records, and verify or reconcile that the counterparty is updating their books and records to say the same thing. Just for belt and suspenders, we'll want to make sure that the holdings that are reported to us by the markets, the depositories, the custodians, are exactly the same as we have within our internal books and records. Make sense? Okay, so that's a really high level end to end. Let's reel it all back and start at the beginning and get into the details. Trade execution. Okay, what is a trade? It's a legal agreement to buy or to sell. Like any transaction, the buyer expects to receive the goods after paying for them, and the seller expects the payment, after transferring the goods to the buyer. The only complexity that Securities add is that both sides of that exchange must happen simultaneously. Otherwise, lots of risk for everyone and for the market itself. And that's just the simplest of transaction types, to buy and sell. There are other transaction types. There's lending, there's borrowing, there's something called repo securities. Repo is short for repurchase agreement. It's a form of short-term borrowing for government securities. And there are transaction types that help just move securities, like bonds as collateral. I'll get into the details of that last one in a sec. Just want to quickly reiterate the definition of trade execution, this first in-depth. Trade execution is the agreement to buy or to sell between two parties, at least two parties, each of whom considers the other the counterparty. Who can the counterparty be? If you are, for instance, JP Morgan, there are usually two types of counterparties: other investment banks, think Morgan Stanley, Deutsche, Credit Suisse, and or institutional clients, think the true clients of each of those banks I mentioned. Trade execution needs a dance partner. Could be a brokerage firm, could be a pension fund. A trade could be between a broker and a proprietary trader. Quick definition: proprietary trading means that a firm is taking on a securities position or securities trade for its own account, as opposed to for someone else's, one of its clients. A trade could be between two proprietary firms trading for themselves. Anyone can dance with anyone else. You just need a dance floor and some rules. In fact, back in the old days, traders did it just face to face, and one party would sell, the other party would buy, and the idea of market making was just some dude holding up, prices at which they were willing to trade, little signs. No one misses those days. There's electronic versions of that today. those blinking bid and ask prices that keep changing, saving a lot of cardboard signs and trees. So, other terms to know. An order, which is not an execution yet. You order a pizza, it's not a pizza yet. An order is when a party says what they want to buy or sell. They usually specify a particular quantity, specific security at a given price. That's usually, but there are also less specific orders like just buy 1,000 shares of Apple at whatever the market price is. Not all orders turn into an executed trade. For instance, if someone places an order for 1,000 shares of Apple at half their current market price, there's no guarantee that that trade will be executed. An executed trade needs someone on the other side of that trade that's amenable to the conditions of that trade, like some fool who would want to sell Apple at half price in that example. That's where the term trade matching comes into the picture. Electronic markets do this really fast, trade matching, and at scale. Someone who wants to buy X is matched with someone that wants to sell X on the same terms. That's the definition of an order-driven market. An order-driven market is a financial market where all buyers and sellers display the prices at which they want to buy or sell a particular security and the amounts they want to buy or sell. The alternative to that, to an order-driven market, is what's called a quote-driven market. It's an electronic exchange usually in which prices are determined from bid and ask quotes made by market makers, dealers, or specialists. In a quote-driven market, which is sometimes called a price-driven market, dealers they'll fill orders from their own inventory or by matching them with other orders. So order-driven versus quote-driven, good to know. I think I use the words bid and ask. Industry jargon, again, a bid is the highest price someone will pay for something, and an ask is the lowest price the other side will sell that same something. The bid price will almost always be lower than the ask price. And some people call the ask price the offer price because, we love our jargon. Other jargonistic terms, your position. That's just basic math. If you've bought 1 share of Apple and you buy 5 more, you've got a position of 6 shares of Apple. You're ready to retire at that point. But wait, you got a toothache and you need cash for a dentist. So you sell 5 of those 6 shares. You're back down to a position of 1 Apple share. Get back to work or, live with cat food. There's the tiniest bit of math complexity with positions. And I know this is going to sound obvious, but there's a very good chance that not every stock in your holding was executed at the same price. So if you have 10 shares of Apple, and I use small numbers here just to keep it simple, some of the 10 shares were probably bought at different prices, even if those prices were different by a penny. Accounting is important because institutions don't buy 10 shares, they buy 10 million. And there's zero chance that all 10 million were the exact same price. People use average prices to describe their holdings, but every penny needs to be accounted for. An active trader or a trading institution will have executed many trades, so it's not particularly useful to know what the average price is. Traders, the front office, the people who sit in the front office, they need to know both the average price and all the variations in order to figure out their next move. And there's no guarantee that a trader will even want to execute a trade if they're not armed with the price and purchase history. Because the trader ultimately works for and protects the interests of their firm, right? Which inevitably cares about its P&L, its profit and loss. Next question. How does trade execution start? If you listen to my walk about fund accounting, you'll remember how we talked about investors and investment strategies. Those strategies turn into trading decisions. For instance, a buy or a sell of 1 million shares of Apple. When the time is right, as determined by that strategy, the front office would place an order with a broker, usually an investment bank, depending on the current market price of that security and whether the strategy needs to wait for a specific buy or sell price. The order would be put in by the front office, the trader, or actually the salesperson, and it would trigger the next step of the trade life cycle at their investment bank or whatever institution is receiving the order. Wait, I just used the term salesperson. Probably worth mentioning that there are two types of roles in the front office: traders and salespeople. It's the salespeople who interact with clients, that, stereotypical dude you see in the movies like The Wolf of Wall Street. He's on the phone trying to sell someone or on buying this or selling that. And salespeople record the details of the client's order, just another way to kick off the trade life cycle. So whether it's a trader on the front office or a salesperson in the front office, someone inputs the details of that trade into the electronic system, the front office platform. What they record is, let's go, the 7, who the client is, what the product is that's being sold or bought, whether it's a buy or sell, its price. What is the price of it? If it's 4. So if it's a large enough trade, by the way, one that has like at least 10,000 shares of stock, or one that's worth more than $200,000 US, and it's called a block trade. That's a term of art for a trade that is large, privately negotiated transaction, arranged away from public markets to lessen the effect on the security's public price. All block trade really adds to the trade life cycle is scale and complexity, because when the order is executed, it'll probably need to be split into a number of chunks of the security, each of which might have a slightly different price. Chunk is not a term of art. It's just me being me. So once the salesperson has the details of the order, and this is important, they're not allowed to do the next step. One part of that is control. The other is that the salesperson doesn't have P&L responsibility within the front office. So the salesperson will pass that order to that other role, the trader broker within their firm. They'll call them or email them or use their firm's OMS, their order management system, to put all of the details in for the order into the system, or tell them that. Then it's the trader or broker's part. They're also called agents and principals. And their part is distinct from the salesperson. One, because the internal controls need to separate those roles to reduce risk to the bank. 2, because there are legal implications around the way that they act on an individual trade basis. So as an agent, the broker tries to find a third party willing to trade on the terms of the order. A little complexity there, because a third party is only needed if the bank has no position in that security themselves, or if the terms of the order don't match what the bank wants to do with the securities that it does hold. In plain English, if you say that you want to buy 10 shares of Apple for $1, and I don't hold 10 shares, I need to find someone else who does. I'm going to make that market. If you say that you want to buy 10 shares of Apple for $1, and I do have 10 shares, but I want $2 for each, then I need to find someone who is cool with selling their shares at $1. But again, it's market making. The bank is going to make money from that trade, that process of finding the other, whether they hold Apple shares or not, meaning whether the bank holds Apple shares or not, whether they want to sell them at $1 or not. They're going to earn a transaction fee, a commission on the trade. So they'll do their best to look for a counterparty. That said, completing the order is not guaranteed. It's pretty windy today. The price might not get any takers. The amount you want might not be available. The fancy term for that is liquidity. Once the order's trade terms find their dance partner, their dance partner, like bam, execute a trade. The other way this can happen is that the client, the one who would have been on the phone with the salesperson, they place the order themselves. Think online trading. And the bank systems serve as the agent on the trade. And there are also cases where the bank acts as principal, trading for themselves with their money and or securities. You would do the same if you were, the intermediary. If your drunk Uncle Bob wanted to sell his Apple shares for $1 instead of whatever sky high number they're trading for today, you wouldn't find someone else to rob your uncle and buy them yourself and wait for him to sober up. If you wanted to buy, one share of Apple for $1 million, you don't need to look for someone else. You would sell him your share. Wonder where the hell he got $1 million. Well, banks get a lot of Uncle Bobs or Uncle Bob requests. And instead of saying, Uncle Bob, put down the drink, they execute his awful wishes with their own assets. No third party required. And it's not just Uncle Bob requests. A bank might be holding more shares of Apple than their investment strategy advises. So when someone wants to buy from the market, the bank uses their own shares. They sell directly to the client, reduce their position, and exercise some investment discipline. That whole dynamic that I just described is one of the reasons why banks put internal controls in place, distinguishing clear lines between the role of a salesperson and a trader, for instance. The control tries to protect clients from unscrupulous practices that blur that line. Separation of duties keeps it ethically clean or cleaner, and, Uncle Bob is protected. They're not doing it just because they're good people. They are. But they also have regulators watching them like hawks. So banks need to be able to prove to market authorities that their clients did right by them. When a bank says that it's acting as a principal, that implies that they had a position themselves and traded it off their books. Okay, so that's trading as agents versus trading as principals. Either way, a trade gets executed successfully when its terms in its order are met. Once that's done, the bank lets all the parties know the details of the execution. Counterparty 1, Uncle Bob, sold 1 million shares of Apple for $1. To counterparty 2, you. The counterparties don't necessarily see who the other side of the trade is. It just looks like the other side's broker or bank. We now know the counterparties, the alleged specifics of the trade, and it's time for back office fun. What happens post-trade execution for each party involved? How do we get to settlement in the next 24, 48, 72 hours? It starts with trade capture. Trade capture is the formal process of recording the details of an individual trade or execution. This is the baseline information that the back office needs to do their bits to fulfill their client's legal commitment to their counterparty. So the trader records those 4 things I mentioned. I'll go over them again. The details of the transaction, the minimum I mentioned, right? The 7. First and foremost, and most important, the trade date. Why is that the most important? Because there's a ticking clock that starts the minute the trade is executed. If this data is incorrect, we're screwed on multiple levels, not just because of the urgency of the ticking clock, of the trade settlement needing to happen, but also because of a lot of important events are triggered for the owner of the trade, of the securities by the trade date. For instance, dividends and other corporate actions, they're all based on exactly when you become the owner of a product. So back to the 7. 1, trade date, captured accurately. We need to know the trade day, the hour, the minute, all of it. It's also important so you don't piss off your regulators. Why? Because their job is to protect investors. That's also why all trading conversations are recorded. If there is a client who wants to dispute anything about the trade, the regulators can check the recordings. Next, settlement date, also known as the contractual settlement date or the value date. Easy enough. It's that point in the very near future by when everything in this trade's life cycle should be done and dusted. This is all basic arithmetic. On the trade date, which we'll call T for trade date, you know the settlement date, T plus 1, or T plus 2, or T plus 3, where the 1, 2, and 3 is basically the number of work days after which the trade needs to settle. Sometimes called rolling settlements. It's the process of settling securities trades on successive dates based on the specific date when the original trade was made, so that trades executed today will have a settlement date 1 business day later, T plus 1, or 2 business days later, T plus 2. See where this is going? That was more complex than it needed to be. Just know that the markets set standards about how quickly you must settle every trade, whether it's T plus 1 day after the trade, or T plus 50 days after the trade. That's, by the way, I made that up. There's no one that does T plus 50. If every counterparty systems used the same reference data, the same security master, client master that we talked about at the front of the walk, the same reference data, then it wouldn't need to be T plus 1. It could be T plus 1 millisecond. But we're still decades away from that. I like to think about rolling settlements like each trade lights a fuse. Plus 1, T plus 2, T plus 3 day fuse, depending on the market. And every business day, the back office needs to figure out quickly for each trade whether to cut the red wire or the blue wire, to use a movie analogy. I actually don't give much regard to T plus 2 or T plus 3 because clients live in the here and now and they have modern day expectations, what I call T plus now. Can you go back to the old days when it was T plus 10? Sure. But you'll need a counterparty who is also fond of shag carpeting. If you both do, I guess, God bless. Just remember to capture the trade with the agreed upon settlement date on it. Okay, what else? We covered trade date and settlement date, the terms, whether you are buying or selling. This isn't as straightforward as it sounds because you can short a security, sell it when you don't hold it, and bet that its price will drop, allowing you to profit from the dip. And that's just the most obvious example. That's the buy or sell piece of the data. Then there's quantity. Okay, that's the number of shares that you're buying or selling. The security itself, or the symbol for that security, is important. That's not as straightforward as you think either, given that, companies trade across multiple markets and potentially different symbols. Plus, there are products like bonds that have hundreds, if not thousands, of identical issuer names, coupon rates, maturity dates, with the only distinguishing factor being that one is dollar denominated while the other is yen. It's all kinds of fun, or maddening, depending on what you're drinking. The key during the trade capture step is to record the exact product, the exactly unique security identifier that has been bought or sold. Next, the price. Whether that's the equity's unit price, what one share costs, or the bond's percentage price, because bond prices are expressed in percentages, the price is a pretty important detail. So what did I miss of the 7? The 7 minimum pieces: the trade date 1, settlement date 2, whether it's a buy or a sell. 4 was quantity. The security identifier was 5. The price is 6. Oh, 7. Obvious. The who, the counterparties, the exact counterparty, including, its location. So for example, if you're executing a trade with JP Morgan, it's not just enough to capture it as JPM because there are different businesses and sub-businesses and organizations and sub-organizations across JP Morgan. Your counterparty could be in New York, London, Tokyo, Geneva, anywhere, and each is a distinct legal entity. Trading with JP is not just trading with JP. There's a business context that must be captured. Okay, so those are the 7. Let's quickly talk about the intersection of data quality and risk. Every back office process is really about risk mitigation. Every process is about having a belt and suspenders approach to getting the data right, getting the details right, not just in your systems, but in your counterparties, in your custodians, in their depositories, anything other than stellar data quality, and we're at risk of losing money. Ours, the clients, the counterparties. The clock is ticking, and our goal is to have impeccably accurate data in every affected system across the strait, and all of that before the date of settlement. Anything could go wrong, and does. Fat fingering in an extra couple zeros without the period. Data sent in is not always data received. Duplicate trades, a checker failing to follow the right steps of their maker. Duplicate changes to duplicate trades. Missing data, God, that's horrible. Competing versions of the truth in the same golden source. The ops person that you're collaborating with, on the other side, might be replaced by another mid-process, someone who's less collaborative, or more likely someone who is much more knowledgeable, but therefore much busier midway through the process, so they have less time for you. Add to all of that complexity COVID or seasonal flooding or other natural disasters that have your team unexpectedly. The next week, Russia invades Ukraine or some other man-made disaster happens. Extreme volatility in the markets that doubles the amount of trades for a week, that triple your exception queues, the work that's manually done. Given the state of data quality across banks, across institutions, I'm shocked they're not falling over every other week. What compensates for that poor data quality? What compensates for the mess they have to deal with at their counterparty shop? World-class collaboration. That's the only answer today. And it's world-class collaboration every day. World-class monitoring every day. World-class problem identification and resolution every day. For millions of trades with thousands of counterparties. There's a word for that, and it's not SCP. It's ops, the people who staff the back office. If I had a drink, I'd toast you, but drinking this early in the morning is probably not a good idea. All right, enough praise to the people doing the hard work. Next in the end-to-end flow after trade capture is trade enrichment, or more accurately, post-trade enrichment. So what is it? After successfully capturing the trade, that last step, trade enrichment is the process of going from minimum trade data, the 7 fields that we just talked about, to adding all essential information that the back office will need to settle the trade. In data science, it's called data wrangling, although it's a little bit easier here because most of what we're wrangling sits in our data masters, hopefully. Starting with the incomplete data, you have those 7 fields. We systematically add all the data that should be there, which usually rests in the security master, the client master, reference data masters that we touched, we touched on at the very beginning of the call. We enrich those 7 with predefined enrichment rules. And we have rules because we've done this a million times. The rules identify things such as the cash value of the trade, how much cash we're going to need to pay for what we bought from the counterparty, or the flip side, the amount of cash we're due from the counterparty. That one you'd think is basic math, but it can get pretty hairy when you consider that sophisticated clients are trading across multiple currencies, each of which have dynamic exchange rates. How you navigate a lot of that is, however, Well, it's you do it how your client has previously told you to do it. Those client specified rules are in what's called the SSI, which is short for Standing Settlement Instructions. So a client's SSI might say that whenever they trade in any market where the default currency is not the yen, the post-trade proceeds should land back in their books as yen. Japanese clients do that a lot. So it's a little joke about the obvious. So we need to have crisp, fresh data about how every client prefers to settle in every reasonable scenario. There are dozens and dozens of different security markets around the world, and some clients dabble in one and other clients dabble in 50. We don't need to squeeze rules and preferences out of every client for every market, for every conceivable scenario, but we do need to have it for their usual trading habits. We need to know precisely where their trade started, how they want to navigate that terrain, and how they prefer to settle that particular kind of transaction. Client preferences, or at least the client preference rules, can be based on a lot of things: the security type, the location of the trading legal entity, the jurisdiction that they're trading in, their operating model, their operating discipline, anything they think is relevant to their trading needs. And everyone does it just a little bit differently. What other kind of information lives in an SSI? Let's see. Their custodial preferences, because big firms realized after the crash of 2008 that they should custody their assets across multiple custodians to mitigate risk and to leverage each custodian for its particular strengths. And we store all of these rules because if we didn't, we'd drive our clients crazy asking them after every trade. Most firms actually capture those client preferences during their client onboarding process before a single order is ever placed. Do those rules ever change? Absolutely. They change whenever the operating discipline of the client changes. They change when they enter new markets or change operating strategies in existing markets. They change when their banks change, when their custodians change, when the rules of the market change. SSI is the most critical enrichment source for those 7 trade details. Its add to the enrichment impacts everything, not the least of which is how we manage the client's expectations, their comms preferences, with them, with their servicers, their ops protocols, everything. How are we going to issue instructions to their servicers, their custodian? SSI is not the only source of enrichment. Think of all the disconnected systems that a company has internally. Think about how old they are and how each one comes with its own system-specific ID. Well, that trade data needs to be enriched with unique keys to many of those systems. Bad example. Your firm has a 30-year-old cash platform. In order to know if the client has enough cash to cover their trade, their buy, the trade data needs to be enriched with a unique ID to that ancient cash system, a hook that allows for something very basic to happen on that legacy cash system. Now, multiply that example by all your crappy disconnected systems. If you get trade enrichment right, then you might go from minimum viable trade data, the 7, to hundreds of fields. Every piece of data you'll need to get to a successful, timely settlement. And that enriched data isn't just for us. Any back and forth we have with counterparties needs our trade reference number and their trade reference number, because it would be too easy to just have a common trade reference ID. Get all that right, and you get one step closer to STP, straight through processing, at least on the data that's heading out your door. Coming back, not so much, because the outside world, every counterparty is doing the same trade enrichment for themselves. Next up in the life cycle, trade confirmation. We have enriched our trade to the point where we have all of the data and details we will need. And I emphasize our and we because we still don't know if our counterparty has the exact same details, right? Remember, we have our systems, they have theirs. We have our version of the truth, they have theirs. American politics. But unlike American politics, when either party's subjective truth doesn't match the other party's, people on both sides of the aisle do their best to, get to the objective truth. It's refreshing, really. So the whole point of trade confirmation process is to get everyone to agree on the objective truth, not about gun control or climate change, although that would be awesome, about the details of the trade, making sure no cars hit me. Trade confirmation it's both sides talking it out, emailing it out to reduce risk on both sides. It's a living embodiment of shared responsibility before time runs out and both sides lose. Imagine if we applied this process to public policy. I mean, we have 3 days to all agree on the question words, the what, the security, the when, the trade date, the where, the market, and how much, the price. The only piece trade confirms ignore is the why. That's because, it's proprietary. No one should know why you're doing what you're doing. The other thing trade confirmations do is provide clients with that warm, fuzzy sense that everything is going to be fine. A quickly received confirm is psychological validation that what they did, the trade, isn't fake news. It's, and professionals are looking at getting it done accurately right now with urgency. There's some gaming involved. For instance, if you are proactive and issue a trade confirm to the counterparty, the ball is entirely in their court. Similarly, if you're on the receiving end of a trade confirmation, it would be wise to do everything you can to make sure it's accurate. Because if you fail, or worse, if you make a conscious decision not to check it, the risk is now yours. Because if it has the wrong what, when, where, how much, if there's any loss that the counterparty incurs, unfortunately, they would look at you to make them whole. It's a very risky approach to say, yeah, I've received a trade, but no, I don't have the time to compare it to my internal details. Similarly, if you don't issue a confirmation, you risk losing more relationships than just the one with the counterparty. You risk reputational damage, regulatory scrutiny, fines, lawsuits, zombies, bad things. There are jurisdictions where if you fail to report the details of a trade for trade matching purposes, you could be fined by the regulatory authorities, regardless of whether you've successfully matched the trade or not. The lack of timely participation in the process is just as hazardous as getting the outcomes wrong. That means you need to know when confirmations should be issued. Answer: as soon as possible after trade execution. How do you issue a trade confirmation? Well, the client will tell you themselves. They'll say, do it via email, via phone call, via the Swift network, if possible. Usually email. Confirms used to be on a piece of paper in the old days. Back then, they used to call it a contract because it marked the verbal contract between those two guys holding up the signs. I'm ashamed to say that fax is still a reasonably popular method for sending trade confirms. In 2023, we should all be ashamed because there's no way to end a sentence. Fax are evil. They're risky. Oh, and I mentioned Swift networks without explaining it. Swift is an acronym. No one knows what it stands for. Maybe the Illuminati do? No. It's actually SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, SWIFT. Started as a Belgian cooperative dedicated to the execution of financial transactions and payments between banks worldwide. In plain English, instead of sending faxes or emails from human to human, SWIFT lets you send machine-to-machine trade messages. and confirms, helping automate a ton of processes, getting everyone a lot closer to STP, straight through processing. Swift was founded in 1973. I dare you to come up with a good reason to remember that bit of trivia. 1973. Okay. The only other thing to note, it's a subscription service. Predates Netflix by a quarter century. Way better content, unless you like documentaries. And speaking of content, what information goes into trade confirmations? The trade reference number, because if our counterparty receives this and they find any glaring errors on it, they'll call us back. When they do, we'll want to know what they're talking about, because their call could be about 1,000 different trades with us. So when they call, they'll read off that trade confirmation number we sent them, anchoring them in our reference data. And we'll quickly check our books and records, and bam, we'll find the transaction in question. The confirm also includes the minimum 7 we've been talking about. It'll include what's called an ISIN number, or an ISIN code, ISIN. It's an acronym for International Securities Identification Number. Again, no reason for anyone to remember what ISIN is short for. But the confirm might include the name of the depot or the nostro. Depot is jargon for where the security needs to be delivered. Usually comes as a cash account number. And a nostro refers to an account number that a bank holds in a foreign currency in another bank. It might include the name of the custodian and their associated account numbers. And the lawyers always make you add a bunch of stuff like the rules or ruling body under which the trade was executed, because, everyone reads that. They don't. Actually, most people check the dates, the amounts, and the prices. Everything else is there in the event of a dispute with the counterparty. Funniest part of this whole thing is that once you send the confirm, the other side compares it with their own books and records, and if they agree, they intentionally don't let us know that they agree to it. It's a legal maneuver, actually, in case they're wrong that it's right. We have to assume that their silence means agreement. It's like a failing marriage. There's also some electronic trade matching, which I'm not going to go into because it's done mostly with systems, not people. And this video is probably not going to be watched by any systems for at least a couple of years. So next in the end-to-end trade life cycle is trade settlement. There's this thing called a settlement instruction, critical part of the process if the trade is to be settled. If you are to move the securities in the cash from one counterparty to the other, if you do everything else right, but you fail to issue this instruction, your trade will not be settled. So, trade settlement would fail. Securities wouldn't move, cash wouldn't move, and everyone would suffer some kind of loss. Monetary for sure, but also reputational, regulatory, hearing loss, because people will be screaming at you. So it's important to know the different types of instructions at this stage. I covered Swift messages types in the second half of that first video on custody banking when I was talking about corporate actions. You might want to rewatch that. Now, let's talk about instructions that trigger the move of securities and cash. The big use case is what happens in the majority of trades, the simultaneous exchange of securities for cash. But there's also other use cases, right? Like when an instruction should only trigger the movement of securities without the payment, or conversely, the cash-only movement. The trade settlement step is also when there's a lot of matching, specifically the matching of two sets of hopefully identical instructions, is interested in getting the trade to the status of matched so the actual settlement can happen and the risk between counterparties is mitigated. It's a trustless system, and with good reason. The seller needs to pass over the securities, and at the same time, the buyer passes over the cash. So they rely on process safeguards. Think about it. How, if you were a bank, would you settle a trade without risk to yourself? You would require the client to pay first, and only after you have the money in your hands would you, as a bank, issue the instructions for the delivery of the securities. You've seen this in movies a million times. It's usually drugs for cash or guns for cash, but there's always a little dance as the dealers and the buyers try to reduce the risks of being conned. Of course, the risk, the movie double cross, always comes in that split second when the protagonist, in our case, a bank, is actually without either the asset or the cash. As long as you have one of the suitcases, you're good. But being without either, you know, climactic gunfight. So, what's on a settlement instruction? Fewer details than the emails we've been passing back and forth so far in the trade life cycle. The account number, where you want the movements to happen, because every firm will have more than one account number. The instruction will also have your trade reference number, super important for STP, because without the trade reference number, you can't update the details of the trade within your own trade records. The instruction would need to be explicit about whether you want to deliver or to receive, the drugs, not the cash, because they're securities. And when you talk about deliver or receipt, it's all about the securities, not the cash. And there's usually a custodian involved. What else? The instruction will have, the ISIN. Remember the ISIN we talked about? ISIN. Like almost everything else on the confirm, the ISIN is trying to anchor the reader in some common identifiers that the process up until this point has been, tying back to the systems of both parties. What else? The settlement currency. That's where SSI standing settlement instructions rear their head again. Key dates. So everyone is on the same page about the ticking clock and the account numbers of the counterparty. And everything should match on both the confirms issued, you and your counterparties. And if it's electronic, it needs to be encrypted to avoid, sophisticated fraud. Anyone can fake a fax. That's why I think they're evil. So encryption reduces risk, especially given the multi-million-dollar temptations on those faxes. The deadline on the instructions, that differs from market to market, custodian to custodian, depository to depository. If there's any commonality among the deadlines, though, is that they wait for close of business. So no one is panicking at noon. It's always around 6, the evening before the settlement date. And that might sound straightforward, but remember that trades are executed in multiple markets. So 6 p.m. in New York is not 6 p.m. in Brussels, is not 6 p.m. in Kuala Lumpur. Whether you're skating to T+1, trade +1, or T+2 or T+3, that's just all within a complex global ecosystem, time zones galore. Oh, and learn your Swift codes, which I won't cover here. Understand your risks. Example, what happens when you miss a deadline? What happens when you fail to pay the seller on time? Not if, when. What's your process for compensating the sellers, the buyer, whoever is impacted by your failure, or the failure of your counterparty, which honestly is also your failure? A failed dance takes two. Every step has pitfalls, but none of those pitfalls are new or surprising. You issue an instruction, it isn't received. Your org has a playbook for that. There's nothing new under the sun in this space. On top of the usual playbooks for common fails, you'll also want to escalate internally. Most shops require a senior to step in and authorize or accept the risks that each fail entails. So escalate and often It's not a reflection of you needing it. It's because it's effective risk management. You'll need to partner with those seniors in resolving settlement issues. It's not just their awareness you need, but many times their written authority. It's a useful control, given all the moving pieces. Okay, so we just finished issuing a confirm, and the counterparty is cool with the info we put on it. They issue their settlement instructions to the CSD, or custodian. CSD stands for Central Securities Depository, CSD. And now it's time to once again wear down our refresh button, waiting to hear back from the custodian or the CSD what the status is. Are we matched or unmatched? There are pre-settlement statuses that you'll need to be familiar with. And while it would be completely logical for every institution across the globe to use a consistent set of comms, what you get will depend on who is sending it. And you can't settle if your instructions don't match. So, enter custodian banking. My very first walk. I wish it were as simple as matched or unmatched, but the statuses are tied to different levels of matching. 3 groupings of instruction statuses: matched, unmatched, and what's called alleged. The ideal is that first group. Obviously, you match all the details of your instruction and your counterparty instructions perfectly. They match perfectly, the cash amount, the cash settlement amount, everything. But in that group of matched, you can also have instructions that play within what are called tolerances, which is why when I say everything has to perfectly match in the first part of the walk, and I was like, well, not exactly. I didn't want to go into it, but that's what tolerances are. My high school science teacher, a guy named Mr. Jones, used to look at my not so perfect math answers and say, that's close enough for government work. Anyway, tolerances are Mr. Jones-like rules for instructions that don't match perfectly, but match, close enough for government work. Example, if you're dealing with Euroclear in Brussels, if you watched my first video about custody banking, you'll remember that in Europe, the 2 largest clearing systems are Euroclear and Clearstream. They're similar to the DTC in the United States, the Depository Trust and Clearing. The point is that Euroclear and Clearstream provide settlement services for securities. And if you're dealing with Euroclear, that tolerance at Mr. Jones close enough for government work for getting to match status is $25 US. So Euroclear is close enough for government work, $25. Everything else has to be accurate in the settlement instructions, apart from the cash value, which can be different, anywhere up to $25, or the currency equivalent of that, right? Go to $25.01, and even if all your other non-cash value info is perfect, status unmatched. In that second grouping of unmatched, you have 1, the non-cash data didn't match. 2, the non-cash data matched, but the cash fell outside the tolerance. Or 3, there's a missing instruction from one of the 2 players, you or the counterparty. Missing instructions happen all the time because you have a couple of days, as does your counterparty, and you can't know if your counterparty's shop is running smooth, experiencing some problem that you might not be, and how urgently they're taking the resolution of this specific trade. You've done everything on your end, you've issued your set of instructions, but your counterparty is either on fire or they fell asleep. No instruction from them. From the depository's perspective, they don't know whether you or your counterparty recognizes that trade or not, so no match. If it was you that was sleeping and not your counterparty, they issued an instruction and you didn't. That's called an alleged status. So that's 2 of the major types of instructions. Unmatched, which won't settle 3 days after the trade. Matched, which will settle 3 days after the trade. And The third grouping is failed, is the right word. How do I explain this? Okay. I'll put up a chart at this point in the video, hopefully like up here somewhere. And on the x-axis, hopefully you're seeing it now, the columns across the top, it'll list the instruction status, matched, unmatched, failed, or unmatched, matched, failed in column 1. Column 2 will be the trade date. And the next 3 columns will be like the countdown to the settlement date. So 3 days from the trade, T plus 1, T plus 2, T plus 3, and bam, settlement date, which is 3 plus 3. Maybe the final column will be every day after that settlement date, the beyond, right? Okay, so hopefully you're looking at it now. Here's what it means. If you send your settlement instruction on your trade date, congratulations, you have your stuff in order. There's a very good chance that your counterparty doesn't. If your instruction is unmatched on your trade date, you'll get a status of UNM2, which stands for unmet with a priority of 2. The only other priority it could have is 1, and we'll get to that in a second. But there's no need to give it an urgent priority 1 on a trade date because both parties still have a lot of time. UNM2, unmet priority 2. If your instruction is, sent on the day after the trade, T plus 1, and it's unmatched, same status, UNM2, because you still have time to get your house in order. I'm left to right in that unmatched row now, if you're following. Wait 2 days after the trade, and it starts getting serious. UNM1, unmatched priority 1. Siren should be going off. Still unmatched by the settlement date. UNM1, unmatched priority 1. Because someone's about to lose some money if it gets to settlement date, and it's still UNM1, right? Go to the next instruction, the next row, matched. And I'd throw settled in there also. So note to self, make it matched and settled. If you sent your instruction on trade day and match, good on you. But your code is still FUT, not SET. So essentially, it's going to happen in the future, FUT, not it's settled, SET. Because you can't settle before the settlement date. The status back on the matched instruction will be FUT, FUT, FUT for T, T plus 1, and T plus 2 until on the settlement date, T plus 3, bam, you're settled. Yeah, good little dance. Then there's the final row, failed status. Ooh, bad. The good news is that you can't fail on your trade date. Because that's a positive way to look at it. You can't fail on T plus 1 or T plus 2. The other good news is that you only get failed status if you and your counterparty matched. If you can fail on a settlement date, T plus 3, and you'll get one of 4 reasons for failure, right? 4 failure codes. Let's walk through them. CSEC and USEC mean that despite having matched, right, either you or your counterparty don't have the securities you thought you were selling. CSEC stands for counterparty securities, and USEC stands for your securities, not your counterparties. The other 2 fails are the same thing, but for cash. Let me make sure I don't get hit by a car. The counterparty doesn't have the cash in their account to cover their purchase, or you don't have the cash to buy the counterparty securities. Super common. But not because, either side is broke or out of money or out of securities, but because they're probably doing a million trades. And not every trader can know what every other trader is doing at either shop. So those last 2 failed trade statuses would be OTH, your counterparty cannot pay, the other guy can't pay, and PROV, which is essentially you can't pay. Bad, 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 tisk, tisk, tisk. Okay, so what does all that mean for how you operate in the back office? Well, respect the priority one statuses. I know that sounds obvious. Those are imminent danger. If you don't prioritize them, you will lose cash. But it's not just the priority ones that matter. High value trades require more attention. So if you have 2 priority 1 trades for $1 each, and there's a monster $100 million priority 2 trade, well, use common sense. Another dimension of prioritizing your work: important clients and problem clients, actually. If they're unhappy with your service, or if they've demonstrated that their back office is constantly on fire, then up the priority. There's also your own front office to consider. They might have some strategic need, or there might be, consistently fat finger trades. Your front office is important to factor in because the front and back should always be in sync. Oh, and what we started the walk with, the first walk, data quality, right? Stale SSI, stale reference data, missing securities within your masters, and someone will lose money. Maintaining that data as an operating discipline is as important as hitting all your deadlines. They're actually intimately connected. So if you're struggling with matching instructions, there's a pretty good chance your SSI is out of date. Your pain in matching is directly correlated to the quality of information set up and maintained within your firm's security master, client master, reference master. Okay. Did we spend enough time talking about failed settlements? I suppose not. Worth a quarter mile or so. Let's talk about what happens to a trade and cash values and how everything changes when a trade is not settled on its value date. Because a failed trade is not a canceled trade. If you're a buyer or seller, the cost and or proceeds remain the same. That means that both parties, the buyer and the seller, are locked into the original trade cash values. And being illiquid, unable to move or sell or buy again, sucks. You have a contractual commitment that exists between you and the counterparty. And every day that the settlement is delayed, someone will claim that they're losing money because of it. And they're right. Trade cancellations, by the way, can come into the picture, but only if both parties agree. Monetary loss is one impact of a failed settlement. If you're in the business of running a back office, your reputation also suffers. If one of your clients is the counterparty, not if, because one of your clients is the counterparty, you're signaling that you're on fire. So it's not just about the opportunity cost to them, the cost of not getting the cash securities like as soon as possible. It's not just that there's a cash interest loss, meaning you don't land the cash, you can't be earning income on it. Think about how much interest is earned on $1 billion each day. So when $1 billion trade isn't settled, just the interest would probably put me personally, in some serious trouble. My point is that it's not just money. It's that if you fail to settle enough, your client's confidence in you and your abilities diminish. Even if you do what every servicer on the street does and eat the loss of that interest income, reputation's hard to recover. Increased exposure to counterparties is risk. You are not being a good risk manager. And that's all security services are in the business of, risk mitigation. If your middle and back office aren't filled with risk managers, you'll lose confidence, trust, and ultimately your clients. Okay, let's get off my high horse. We filed our instructions. We matched. There were or are market by market subtleties. which I'm not going to go get into other than to say that the best performing markets are the ones with aggressive, fine-hungry authorities and regulators. Like, say what you will about them, they know how to effectively threaten pain, at least to people who care about money. Okay, so we walk through the matching process, literally walk through, and we talked about how every firm has its own unique and broken process and procedures for addressing unmatched instructions. Oh, here's the kicker. Even with unmatched instructions, a settlement, even with matched instructions, a settlement can still fail. So having matched instructions does not guarantee anything other than the next step, which is verifying that you have the securities. Remember those codes? Verifying that you have the securities and or money that you matched on. So the next step, and we touched on it with the SEC chart that I hopefully put up, the USEC, the OTH, the PROV codes that we went over, right? They are essentially signaling that you need to have the securities or not, and that you either have the cash or you don't. So the next step, we verify. I shouldn't say we, because it's more specifically, your depository or custodian figures that out, right? Unless you're the depository or custodian. If the answer is yes, securities are there, cash is there, brilliant. The briefcase full of cash is exchanged for the briefcase full of drugs. By the way, in the movies, they always do this step with open the briefcase, show me the money. Okay, now open your briefcase, show me your drugs. And if everyone sees the money and the drugs, or in our case, when the depository sees the securities and the cash, the final settlement completes. What can get in the way of final settlements? Okay, at this point, just father time, right? Remember that the whole process revolved around a ticking clock. Deadlines that are set as soon as the trade is executed. Deadlines that can't be missed. And your custodian knows this, lives by this. Their systems, old mainframe systems from back in the 70s, do the final pieces in what are called overnight batches. Batch processing. That's jargon for we failed to invest in modernizing our technology. So everyone comes in the next morning and the mainframe elves have moved all the securities and cash, generated all the reports that no one ever reads, and some that everyone read, actually, like a failed trades report. And they see which failure occurred and punish the appropriate elf. Worth noting that if you have a special agreement with your counterparty and all the custodians in the process, you can do intraday settlement, but behind the scenes, those little custody elves are shaking their fists at the sky, like, because magic is an overnight thing. You know, I'll show you. Okay, so failed trade reports are used every day. Large teams of ops folks at both your place and at your counterparties read them. They honest to God, like every line. They pick up their phones to call the counterparty, or they craft an unending number of emails to discuss with their counterparty how to match the unmatched. In some cases, you have to make a change, an amendment. In other cases, they do, right? Super useful report at failed trades report, especially when every day is a crisis of the trades from 2 days ago that remain unsettled. That makes any sense. So every day is a crisis that started, on T, and you are now T+2, or hopefully not T+3. Moving on. Once you're at the point where securities are moving, there's something known as partial settlement. Let's say you sell 10 shares of Apple and you only have 1 share in your account. In some markets, that 1 share will be delivered against what's called a pro rata amount. The proportionate amount of cash will be delivered. And in other markets, it's by agreement between you and the counterparty. So in a situation where you sold 10 Apple shares and you have only one share available on the settlement date, and you are the seller in a market where they have automated partial settlements, then you call the counterparty and ask them whether they will accept partial settlement of, one share against the pro rata cash amount. Again, fancy word meaning proportionate amount, pro rata. All buyers reserve the right to say no. This little side note is important because every institution is doing thousands of buys and sells, thousands of security movements and cash movements. So partial settlements aren't particularly satisfying, right? Because the rest of the settlement is still in the ether. But partials are useful because that one Apple share you get in the partial might help fill another hole in another end-to-end flow. That's a better outcome than unmatched or just flat out fail, right? And just to be clear, partial settlement doesn't negate the original contract. The trade remains intact. It just plays with the timing, giving multiple deliveries and payments versus the usual and very clean one delivery, one payment. The original trade remains intact. It's not being split in any way. It's just the settlement, the logistics of the trade that we're talking about. But what can be done to enforce settlement if you're in desperate, immediate need of all the securities you bought, and it doesn't happen often, but you could be an ass and insist on a process called buy-in. It depends on the market and its buying rules and procedures. You basically issue some comms to the counterparty saying, I'm giving you N number of days to deliver. And if you fail to deliver by that date, we'll go nuclear, invoke the buy-in procedure. You give them a chance, though, a threat, a warning, whatever lets you sleep at night. And if they deliver in that time frame, yay, you're set, no harm, settlement occurred. If they don't deliver to you, though, then it's time to escalate to the market maker to enforce the buy-in procedure. Market maker becomes the buying agent, and they step in to play the role of the evicting sheriff, right? They enforce the settlement through the buying process. The market maker buys the securities from another party, and they forward it to you, the landlord, in that terrible analogy. If the market maker has any additional costs, they charge the seller, the party that failed to deliver. Depending on the market, this might be common because force is needed, or rare because everyone lives in a glass house and knows not to throw stones. Settlement is the transfer of securities and cash between buyer and seller. The next step is reflecting that settlement. In other words, writing its details into your official books and records. Remember the definition of books and records? It might have been right around here in the part where I mentioned it. They're your official ledger of who owns what and how much for your firm and for all your clients. Up until the settlement, your books and records haven't cared about the trade at all, right? Because it wasn't real to the books and records. But once the settlement has occurred, it's real. It's fact. It needs to be on your books. This step, what's also called the cleanup, also eliminates exposure, the risk associated with, the no longer open trade. It's an important step because it aligns your static books and records with the dynamism in the real world, the trading world. Every settled trade needs to be reflected in your books and records. And this is where we start talking about reconciliation, which thankfully is our final piece of the end-to-end securities trade lifecycle. How do you reconcile? Carefully. You terrible joke. You assemble all the evidence in a kind of audit trail, the instruction reference ID, your unique trade reference number, and everything you sent and received to the counterparty, to the custodian, to the depository, everything. And you meticulously check and recheck, not just your answer, but how you got to it. Think high school. Don't just give me the answer. Show me your work, right? Super important because recon is the control of all controls. It needs to be performed thoughtfully and urgently, making it doubly hard. But it ensures that different records within a complex multi-party system agree. Super important because every good business decision depends on accurate information. If your books and records are not accurate, to jail with you. It's that important. And we're back, to where we first started our walk. The trade life cycle has ended once it's recon done and dusted in your books and records. So we covered most of what you'll need to start your journey at a financial services firm, at a custodian. If you didn't happen to take this kind of stuff in college, you have basic definitions for every piece of the trade life cycle, details about trade execution, instruction capture, trade enrichment, taking those 7 fields and that everyone captures and adding everything else you need to the trade data. Then moving on to trade confirmation, which we covered, the trade settlement, all of those pre-trade settlement statuses. We talked about unmatched instructions, failed settlements. We did a little bit of market by market differences. We did partial settlements and your books and records being reconned. Hopefully you learned something. Have a good one.